A meticulous serial killer terrorized the community, a phantom who believed he had outsmarted everyone with his chillingly random acts of violence. Yet as investigators closed in, they uncovered a dark world of pre-staged murder kits, realizing the monster had been hiding in plain sight all along. His final, arrogant act was to smile at the judge, never expecting that a secret trophy from a forgotten crime would be the key to ensuring he spent his life in prison. In a brutal and senseless act of violence, a young woman named Aubrey Holland was abducted from a public park and murdered in Salt Lake City, Utah. The crime was marked by a terrifying lack of motive, suggesting a predator who killed for the sake of killing, a true monster who had descended upon the orderly city. This act of pure malice sent a shockwave of fear through a community built on faith and predictability, shattering its deeply held sense of security. The randomness of the attack was its most horrifying feature, as it meant that anyone at any time could be next. Salt Lake City, nestled against the Wasatch Mountains, has always presented a face of serene order to the world, a city defined by its religious piety and strict social codes. Its wide, clean streets and the towering granite spires of its temple speak to a culture of discipline and shared values, a place where people believe in rules. It is a community where the breaking of those rules has dire consequences, both socially and spiritually, fostering an atmosphere of profound safety. But the abduction of Aubrey Holland introduced a new kind of evil, one that did not play by any rules at all, and its presence felt like a sacrilegious stain upon the city's soul. Aubrey Holland was 24 years old, a recent graduate working as a graphic designer and a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. She was the kind of person who embodied the city's best values. She was kind, diligent, and active in her community, spending her weekends hiking in the nearby canyons. Her life was a tapestry of bright colors and future plans, a life of promise that was violently and senselessly extinguished. The loss of such a vibrant person was a tragedy that her family could barely comprehend, a black hole of grief that consumed their world in an instant. The crime itself was a study in predatory efficiency, a random act of terror designed to make a violent, senseless statement. Aubrey had been enjoying an afternoon run in Liberty Park, a popular green space where families gathered and children played, a place that symbolized the city's peacefulness. It was here that she was targeted, not for who she was, but simply because she was there, a random victim chosen by a monster filled with an inexplicable rage at the world. The perpetrator left behind almost no evidence, a ghost who materialized, struck, and then vanished, leaving only devastation in his wake. The initial investigation was a frustrating search for a needle in a haystack of 1,000 possibilities. Without a clear motive, no robbery, no personal connection, no known enemies, the Salt Lake City Police Department was facing its worst nightmare. Lead Detective Larry George, a veteran of the force with 20 years of experience, understood the unique terror this crime represented. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed, it was a crime of nihilism, an attack on the very fabric of society itself. Detective George found himself grappling with the psychological impact on the community, a city unaccustomed to such arbitrary evil. In Salt Lake City, consequences are expected to follow actions, and good behavior is meant to be a shield against chaos. Aubrey Holland had done everything right, living a good and honorable life, yet she had been consumed by a darkness that defied all logic. This randomness was a poison that seeped into the public consciousness, making every parent hold their children a little tighter and every person look over their shoulder on a quiet street. The Holland family was plunged into a state of suspended animation, their lives frozen at the moment they learned Aubrey was gone. Her father, a stoic man who had spent his life building a safe world for his family, now felt utterly powerless. Her mother found herself lost in a fog of disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of her smiling daughter with the brutal reality of her death. They existed in a space of pure pain, a space where the orderly, faith-driven world they had always known no longer made any sense. The media coverage was immediate and intense, magnifying the city's fear and grief. News reports replayed the last known images of Aubrey smiling in a photo from her recent graduation, a stark reminder of the stolen future. Pundits and experts offered theories, but they all circled the same terrifying truth: the killer was a phantom who could be anyone. This uncertainty was a form of collective torture, turning neighbors into potential suspects and familiar places into sources of dread. The city, which prided itself on its tight-knit community, was suddenly fractured by suspicion and fear. Detective George and his team worked tirelessly, chasing down every lead no matter how small. They interviewed hundreds of people, reviewed hours of security footage from the surrounding area, and scoured Aubrey's digital life for any clue. But every path led to a dead end, every lead dissolved into nothing. The killer had been meticulous, patient, and seemingly invisible, a predator who understood how to move through the world without leaving a trace. The nature of the crime scene suggested a perpetrator who was both organized and confident. There were no signs of a struggle where Aubrey's car was found, indicating she was likely subdued quickly and with overwhelming force. This level of control was chilling to investigators, as it spoke to a predator who had likely done this before. The thought that a serial killer was operating in their city, a place so defined by its moral rectitude, was almost too much for the public to bear. The social codes of Salt Lake City, which normally provided comfort and structure, now felt like a liability. The community's inherent trust and politeness, its assumption of shared values, made it vulnerable to a predator who exploited that very goodness. The killer had used the city's peaceful atmosphere as his hunting ground, turning its greatest strength into a fatal weakness. This realization was a bitter pill for a city that believed its piety was a form of protection. As days turned into weeks, the initial shock gave way to a persistent, gnawing anxiety. The park where Aubrey was taken became a memorial, a place of flowers and whispered prayers, but it was also a place of fear. Parents stopped bringing their children there, and runners chose to exercise indoors, the once vibrant space now a somber reminder of the city's lost innocence. The killer's random act of terror had succeeded. He had made a violent statement that echoed in the silent, fearful spaces he had created. Aubrey Holland's name became a symbol of this new, terrifying reality, and for the people of Salt Lake City, life would never be the same. The hunt for the monster who had stolen her from them and stolen their peace had only just begun. After weeks of relentless police work, a single fortunate break in the case led investigators to a suspect, Tyler Carlson, a 31-year-old contractor who lived a quiet, unassuming life. A partial fingerprint, lifted from a discarded water bottle near where Aubrey Holland's car was found, had finally been matched in the system from a minor offense years prior. The arrest was made quietly, without incident, at Carlson's small, meticulously kept home in a suburb of Salt Lake City, a home that betrayed no hint of the monster living within its walls. Tyler Carlson's demeanor during his arrest was one of chilling calm, his face an unreadable mask of indifference. He showed no surprise, no fear, and no anger, a response so unnatural it immediately set Detective Larry George on edge. In the interrogation room, this unsettling placidity continued. Carlson sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his eyes betraying a flicker of amusement. He seemed to be treating the entire process as a game, a contest of which he was confident he would win. When Detective George began the questioning, Carlson did not speak, instead offering only a faint, knowing smirk. After several minutes of silence, he reached for the pen and notepad that had been left on the table. He began to write, his handwriting neat and precise, and slid the first note across the table. It read, "You have no idea who I am," a simple statement that dripped with arrogance and contempt. This became Carlson's method of communication throughout the hours-long interrogation. He was a note passer, a silent antagonist who refused to give the detectives the satisfaction of hearing his voice. Each note was a taunt, a cryptic puzzle, or a condescending dismissal of their efforts. He seemed to relish the control this gave him, forcing the seasoned detectives to play his twisted game, turning the interrogation into a one-sided, infuriating performance. One note read, "She was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was I in the right one?" This casual cruelty, this reframing of a horrific murder as a matter of cosmic chance, was profoundly disturbing. It revealed a mind completely devoid of empathy, a psychological void where a conscience should have been. Carlson was not just a killer, he was a philosopher of his own depravity, and he was using these notes to articulate his monstrous worldview. Detective George maintained his professional composure, but the notes were a form of psychological warfare. He and his team tried every tactic they knew, presenting the evidence, appealing to any shred of humanity, expressing frustration, but nothing could break Carlson's silent, smug facade. He would simply listen, a slight smile playing on his lips, and then slowly, deliberately, write another infuriating message. The process was maddening, a slow burn of psychological torment orchestrated by a man who was clearly enjoying himself. The atmosphere in Salt Lake City, a place built on open communication and shared testimony, made Carlson's silence all the more jarring. In a culture where people confess their sins and share their beliefs, his refusal to speak was an act of profound defiance. He was not just stonewalling the police, he was rejecting the very foundation of the community's social contract. He was a black hole of information, a locked room in a city of open doors. Another note appeared, this one even more chilling. You think this is the only one? You are looking at the map but only seeing one pin. This cryptic message sent a wave of cold dread through the investigative team. It was the first hint that Aubrey Holland was not his only victim, that they had stumbled upon a prolific serial killer who had been operating undetected for an unknown amount of time. The notes were not a confession in the legal sense, but they were a confession of character. They painted a portrait of a narcissistic sociopath who saw other human beings as objects, as pins on a map for his own amusement. His refusal to speak was not a sign of fear or a tactic to avoid self-incrimination. It was a demonstration of his power. He was communicating that he was in complete control, not just of the interrogation, but of the entire narrative. As the hours dragged on, the notes grew more personal and cruel. Carlson began to write about Aubrey, not with remorse, but with a detached, analytical coldness. She was strong, fought harder than the others. The casual mention of others was a confirmation of their worst fears, but the detached assessment of Aubrey's final moments was an act of pure sadism designed to inflict maximum pain on those who would read it. The psychological toll on the detectives was immense. They were trained to read people, to find the cracks in their stories, but Carlson was offering them nothing but a wall of silent arrogance and handwritten poison. He was a puzzle they couldn't solve, a monster who refused to give them the key to understanding his evil. His silence was louder than any screamed confession, a testament to his absolute lack of a soul. The legal ramifications of this strange interrogation were complex. Without a spoken confession, his notes, while deeply incriminating, would be a challenge for the prosecution. But for Detective George, the goal was no longer just about building a case. It was about understanding the scope of Carlson's depravity. How many other families were out there waiting for answers, their loved ones reduced to a casual mention in a monster's taunting note? The final note Carlson passed before demanding a lawyer was the most terrifying of all. He had drawn a crude map of the United States with a dozen small X's marked in different states. Below it, he wrote a single sentence, "Find my treasures." It was a direct challenge, a horrifying scavenger hunt where the treasures were likely the graves of his forgotten victims. With that, he fell completely silent, his smirk widening ever so slightly, the game now set. The note passer had made his move, leaving a trail of horror for the world to follow, confident that he had already won. The arrest of Tyler Carlson and his silent, taunting confession was only the beginning of a much larger and more horrifying investigation. Acting on the chilling implications of his notes, detectives secured a warrant to search Carlson's home and vehicle, bracing themselves for what they might find. What they discovered in the trunk of his car was a testament to his meticulous, patient, and deeply evil nature, a prepared murder kit, a discovery that proved Aubrey Holland's death was not an impulsive act, but a well-rehearsed performance. The kit was contained in a large, durable duffel bag, its contents neatly organized with a terrifying level of precision. Inside, investigators found a roll of duct tape, zip ties, a tarp, a shovel, a set of knives, and a container of lye. It was a collection of tools whose only purpose was abduction, murder, and the disposal of a body, all packed and ready to go at a moment's notice. The existence of this kit proved that Tyler Carlson was not just a killer, he was a hunter, and he had been actively looking for prey. This discovery sent a new wave of fear through Salt Lake City, a city where such cold-blooded premeditation felt alien and unthinkable. The community, with its emphasis on spontaneity and wholesome family activities, could not comprehend a mind that planned for murder with the same care one might pack for a camping trip. The murder kit was a physical manifestation of a profound evil, a level of calculation that shattered any remaining hope that Aubrey Holland's death was an isolated tragedy. It was clear that her murder was part of a larger, ongoing project of death. For prosecutor Hannah Porter, the murder kit was the cornerstone of her case. It demonstrated premeditation beyond any doubt, elevating the crime to capital murder. It was the kind of evidence a jury could see and touch, a tangible representation of the killer's mindset. Porter, a sharp and tenacious lawyer, knew that this duffel bag and its horrifying contents would be the key to ensuring Tyler Carlson never saw the outside of a prison cell again. The investigation now expanded. Guided by Carlson's taunting note about a map with pins, detectives began a painstaking analysis of Carlson's life, his work as a contractor which took him all over the country, and his financial records. They were no longer just investigating the murder of Aubrey Holland, they were on a grim quest to identify the other victims, the other treasures Carlson had alluded to. The scope of the case had become national, a chilling realization for a police department more accustomed to dealing with local issues. Inside Carlson's house, they found further evidence of his meticulous nature. His home was Spartan, obsessively clean, and devoid of any personal touches. But in a locked safe in his basement, they found a collection of journals filled with his neat, precise handwriting. The journals were not diaries of emotion, but cold, logistical records of his crimes, detailing his methods, his observations, and his chillingly detached thoughts. The journals were a window into the mind of a patient predator. Carlson wrote about stalking potential victims for weeks, learning their routines, and then deciding against them for some small, arbitrary reason. He detailed the process of burying his kill kits in remote locations years in advance, waiting for the perfect opportunity to use them. He was a monster of delayed gratification, a patient spider who could wait years to spring his trap. This level of planning horrified even the most seasoned investigators. It defied the common perception of violent crime as an act of passion or impulse. Carlson's violence was a craft he had honed over many years, a dark hobby he pursued with discipline and dedication. The contrast between this hidden life of meticulous evil and his public persona as a quiet, reliable contractor was a stark illustration of his monstrous duality. The atmosphere in Salt Lake City, with its emphasis on transparency and living an open, righteous life, made Carlson's secret world all the more profane. He had moved among them, a wolf in the flock, his neighbors seeing him as just another quiet man living a simple life. The realization that such profound darkness could exist behind such a normal facade was a deeply unsettling thought for a community that believed goodness and piety were visible, tangible qualities. As detectives cross-referenced the locations mentioned in his journals with missing persons reports from across the country, a horrifying picture began to emerge. They were able to tentatively link Carlson to at least 8 other murders in 5 different states, stretching back over a decade. He was a ghost who had drifted from state to state, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake, his randomness and patience making it impossible for law enforcement to ever connect the dots. The murder kit in his car was not his only one. Following the descriptions in his journals, FBI agents in other states began to unearth other buried kits, each one a time capsule of death waiting to be opened. The discovery of these kits was a chilling confirmation of Carlson's reach and his long-term commitment to his life as a serial killer. He was not just a monster, he was an architect of his own evil, building a legacy of death, one buried kit at a time. For Aubrey Holland's family, this news was both a source of horror and a strange, bitter form of validation. Their daughter had not been killed by a random act of madness, but by a seasoned and prolific predator. Knowing this did not lessen their grief, but it galvanized their resolve to see justice done, not just for Aubrey, but for all the other victims whose names were still unknown. The case against Tyler Carlson was no longer just about one life lost in Salt Lake City. It was about exposing a decade of hidden evil and giving a name to the ghosts he had left behind. As the case against Tyler Carlson moved through the pretrial proceedings, his behavior in the courtroom solidified his image as a man utterly devoid of remorse and consumed by a chilling sense of superiority. He had abandoned his silent, note-passing persona from the interrogation room, but what replaced it was even more disturbing. He was now a performer, an antagonist who seemed to relish the attention of the court, and he used every opportunity to display his contempt for the legal process and the people whose lives he had shattered. During a routine motions hearing, the Holland family sat in the front row of the gallery, their faces etched with a grief that had not subsided in the months since Aubrey's murder. As Aubrey's older sister took her seat, her eyes met Carlson's across the courtroom. In that moment, with a cold, deliberate slowness, Carlson lifted his hand and made a subtle but unmistakable gesture. He drew his index finger across his throat, a silent, sickening threat directed at the grieving young woman. The act was so quick and so subtle that only a few people saw it, but for Aubrey's sister, it was a moment of pure terror. It was a message from the monster who had killed her sibling, a message that his cruelty was not finished, that he could still reach out and touch them with his malice. The family's lawyer immediately alerted the bailiffs, and though Carlson feigned innocence, the incident was a clear window into his unrepentant soul. He was not just a killer, he was a tormentor who fed on the fear and pain of others. This threatening gesture became a defining moment in the public's perception of Tyler Carlson. News of the incident spread quickly, painting a portrait of a defendant who was not just guilty, but actively malevolent. In the orderly, polite society of Salt Lake City, such a blatant act of disrespect and intimidation inside a courtroom was shocking. It violated the sanctity of the judicial process, turning a place of solemn justice into a stage for his personal theater of cruelty. Prosecutor Hannah Porter was furious, but she also recognized the tactical advantage this gave her. Carlson's arrogance was his greatest weakness. Every smirk, every whispered comment to his lawyer, every dismissive eye roll during testimony was another nail in his own coffin. He was so convinced of his own intelligence, so certain he could outsmart them all, that he couldn't stop himself from performing, from showing the world the monster he truly was. Carlson's defense team was fighting an uphill battle, made nearly impossible by their own client. They attempted to build a narrative of a troubled man, perhaps mentally ill, but Carlson's cold, calculating demeanor in court undermined their every effort. He refused to play the part of a remorseful or confused defendant. Instead, he projected an aura of absolute control, as if he were an observer to the proceedings, not the man whose life was on the line. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. The public gallery was always full, a silent chorus of citizens from a city still grappling with the evil in their midst. They watched Carlson's every move, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. They were witnessing something that felt fundamentally alien to their culture of piety and decorum, a man who not only rejected their moral code, but seemed to actively despise it. The judge issued stern warnings to Carlson about his behavior, but they had little effect. Carlson seemed to enjoy the admonishments, treating them as a form of recognition, a sign that he was getting under their skin. He was a psychological parasite, thriving on the negative emotions in the room. His performance was not for the jury or the judge, it was for himself, a constant reaffirmation of his own power and his contempt for the world. For the Holland family, every court appearance was an exercise in endurance. They had to sit in the same room as the man who had stolen their daughter and watch him behave, not with shame, but with a horrifying theatrical arrogance. The threatening gesture was the most overt act, but the daily onslaught of his smirks and his utter lack of humanity was a continuous form of torture. They attended every hearing, not for themselves, but for Aubrey, a silent promise that they would see this through to the end. The pre-trial phase, which is often a dry, procedural affair, was transformed by Carlson into a spectacle. He would study the legal documents with a look of intense, feigned interest, occasionally shaking his head and chuckling as if he had found some amusing amateur error. He was playing the part of the criminal mastermind, the superior intellect forced to suffer the fools of the justice system. It was a pathetic, transparent performance, but it was also deeply unsettling in its sincerity. This behavior reached a new level when a key witness for the prosecution, a former neighbor who had provided a piece of corroborating evidence, was on the stand for a pre-trial deposition. As the witness spoke, Carlson stared at him without blinking, his expression flat and menacing. The witness, a quiet, unassuming man, grew visibly uncomfortable, his voice faltering under the weight of Carlson's silent intimidation. The judge was forced to intervene, ordering Carlson to direct his attention to the front of the courtroom, another small victory for a defendant who measured success in the amount of fear he could generate. Tyler Carlson's mask of remorse was non-existent. In its place was the true, horrifying face of a monster who had no intention of hiding. The trial of Tyler Carlson began on a cold morning in Salt Lake City, the sky a flat, gray sheet that seemed to reflect the somber mood of the city. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with members of the public, the media, and the families whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by the man at the defendant's table. Carlson himself appeared relaxed, even cheerful, a chilling contrast to the heavy, anxious atmosphere that filled the room. He nodded to his lawyers, surveyed the jury, and offered a small, confident smile, a man convinced he was the master of his own fate. Prosecutor Hannah Porter rose to give her opening statement, her expression grim and resolute. She walked not to the jury box, but to a large screen set up at the front of the courtroom. Without a word, she played a video. The screen flickered to life, showing a sunny afternoon, and the sound of laughter filled the courtroom. It was Aubrey Holland, vibrant and alive, telling a funny story to the person filming, her face lit up with a joy that was radiant and infectious. The video was short, less than a minute, but its effect was devastating. For those 60 seconds, Aubrey Holland was not a victim. She was a living, breathing person, her presence so real and so tangible that her absence became a physical ache in the room. The Holland family watched, tears streaming down their faces, a portrait of unimaginable loss. Even the most hardened journalists in the gallery looked down, unable to watch. It was a masterful stroke by the prosecution, a way to introduce the victim not as a piece of evidence, but as a stolen human life. When the video ended, the screen went black and a profound silence descended upon the courtroom. Hannah Porter let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "That was Aubrey Holland," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "That is the life that he," she paused, turning to point directly at the defendant, "stole from this world. That is the light that he extinguished for no other reason than his own monstrous pleasure." Carlson's reaction to the video was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. He watched it with a look of detached curiosity, as if observing a scientific specimen. There was no flicker of shame, no hint of regret, only a faint, analytical coldness in his eyes. He was not seeing a person, he was seeing an object, a memory that he had created, and there was a subtle but unmistakable pride in his expression. As Porter began to lay out the state's case, detailing the abduction, the murder, and the chilling discovery of the kill kit, Carlson listened with an air of theatrical boredom. He stifled a yawn, tapped his fingers on the table, and occasionally whispered something to his lawyer, followed by a quiet chuckle. His disrespect was so profound, so blatant, that the judge had to stop the proceedings to issue a sharp warning, reminding the defendant that he was on trial for his life, not a guest at a matinee. The city of Salt Lake City, with its deeply ingrained culture of respect for authority and solemn occasions, watched these proceedings with a growing sense of outrage. The trial was being broadcast locally, and Carlson's courtroom antics became a daily topic of conversation. His utter contempt for the process was an insult to the community's values, a desecration of the sacred space of the courtroom. He was not just defying the law, he was mocking their entire way of life. The defense's opening statement was a difficult one to make. They were forced to acknowledge the tragedy of Aubrey Holland's death, but attempted to plant seeds of doubt about the evidence connecting it to their client. It was a standard defense strategy, but it rang hollow in the face of Carlson's own behavior. How could they argue for reasonable doubt when the defendant himself was projecting such absolute, arrogant guilt? The first day of the trial set the tone for the brutal, emotional battle that was to come. The prosecution had made it clear that they were not just trying a man for a crime, they were putting evil itself on display. They were going to force the jury and the world to look at the unvarnished reality of what Tyler Carlson was, to see the soulless void that existed behind his confident smirk. For the Holland family, the day was an agonizing ordeal. The video of Aubrey was both a beautiful tribute and a fresh wave of grief. Seeing her so happy, so full of life, only magnified the horror of what had been done to her. And to have to watch her murderer sit just feet away, bored and amused by the proceedings, was a test of their endurance that felt almost impossible to bear. As the court adjourned for the day, Tyler Carlson stood, and as he was led away by the bailiffs, he glanced back at the Holland family. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes held a look of triumphant satisfaction. He had been the center of attention, the focus of all the fear and anger in the room, and he had enjoyed every single moment. The trial had begun, and for the monster at its center, the show was everything he had hoped it would be. The victim's own words, in the form of that joyful, heartbreaking video, had established the stakes, and now the long, dark process of holding her killer accountable would unfold. As the prosecution's case against Tyler Carlson unfolded, the evidence presented was a methodical and damning catalog of his secret life as a serial predator. Hannah Porter and her team built their case brick by brick, laying a foundation of forensic evidence that was irrefutable. Yet, the most compelling and novel piece of evidence came from an expert in a field that was still relatively new to many in the courtroom: geographic profiling. The prosecution called Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned criminologist and profiler, to the stand. Dr. Finch, a quiet academic man, explained the science of geographic profiling to the jury. He described it as a method of analyzing the spatial patterns of a criminal's behavior to determine their most probable area of operation, their comfort zone. It was a science that blended psychology, geography, and statistics to find the hidden logic in a killer's seemingly random movements. On the large screen in the courtroom, Dr. Finch displayed a map of Salt Lake City and the surrounding areas. He first marked the location where Aubrey Holland was abducted from Liberty Park. Then he marked the remote canyon where her body was discovered. These 2 points, he explained, were the anchor points for his analysis. They represented the start and end of the crime, a geographic signature of the perpetrator. Carlson watched the screen with a look of intense, almost academic interest. For the first time, his mask of bored indifference seemed to crack, replaced by a focused curiosity. He leaned forward, studying the map as if he were a student in a lecture, his arrogance momentarily eclipsed by his intellectual vanity. He was watching an expert deconstruct his masterpiece, and he was clearly intrigued by the process. Dr. Finch then began to add more data to the map. He overlaid Carlson's known locations, his home address, his office, the supply stores he frequented, and cell tower data from the day of the murder. A complex web of lines and shaded areas began to form on the screen. Dr. Finch explained that serial offenders, even those who believe they are being random, operate within a predictable geographic buffer zone. They hunt close enough to home for comfort and familiarity, but far enough away to feel a sense of security. The tension in the courtroom grew as Dr. Finch's analysis took shape. He was in essence reverse engineering the killer's mind, using geography as his guide. The residents of Salt Lake City in the gallery watched, mesmerized. Their city, a place they knew so well, was being reinterpreted as a hunting ground, its familiar streets and landmarks taking on a sinister new meaning. The very structure of their community, its layout and design, had been used by Carlson as a tool for his evil. Then came the climax of Dr. Finch's testimony. He revealed that his analysis had produced a Jeopardy surface, a color-coded probability map showing the most likely area where the perpetrator resided. A large, dark red area bloomed on the screen, a statistical bullseye, and right in the center of that red zone was a single, flashing point, the location of Tyler Carlson's house. The gasp from the gallery was audible. But Dr. Finch was not finished. He then expanded the map to show the entire United States, using the information from Carlson's journals and the locations of his suspected other victims, the pins on his map. Dr. Finch had conducted a macro analysis. One by one, he added the locations of other abductions and body disposal sites from Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and Colorado. With each new point, the national scope of Carlson's reign of terror became terrifyingly clear. Dr. Finch explained that Carlson's work as a contractor, which gave him a legitimate reason to travel, was the perfect cover. He had used his job to create a vast hunting territory, a network of comfort zones across the western United States. He would travel for a job, bury a kill kit, and then wait, sometimes for years, until the opportunity arose to return and commit a murder, confident that no one would ever connect the disparate crimes. The geographic profile was a stunning piece of evidence. It was a visual representation of Carlson's life's work, a map of his depravity. It proved that Aubrey Holland was not a random, one-time victim. She was the latest data point in a long and horrifying series, a local tragedy that was part of a much larger, national nightmare. For the jury, it was powerful, scientific proof that the man sitting before them was not just a murderer, but a monster of terrifying patience and scope. As Dr. Finch concluded his testimony, Tyler Carlson sat back in his chair. The curiosity was gone, replaced by his familiar, arrogant smirk, but his eyes told a different story. They darted to the jury, then to the judge, a flicker of something new, perhaps a hint of respect for the science that had unmasked him, or perhaps, for the first time, a sliver of fear. The map had exposed him, turning his secret chaotic world into a clear and logical pattern of evil, and he knew in that moment that the game was changing. In a move that stunned the courtroom and went against the frantic advice of his own legal team, Tyler Carlson insisted on taking the stand in his own defense. It was an act of supreme narcissistic folly, a decision born from his unshakable belief that he was the smartest person in any room. He was convinced that he could outwit the prosecutor, charm the jury, and dismantle the state's case with his own superior intellect and logic. It was a gamble that would prove to be spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. Carlson walked to the witness stand with a confident stride, a man in his element. He was sworn in, and for the first time the court would hear, at length, the voice of the man who had only communicated in taunting, handwritten notes. His voice was calm, measured, and articulate, but it was devoid of any warmth or emotion, a flat, robotic tone that was as chilling as his silence had been. His own lawyer began the direct examination, attempting to guide him through a series of carefully rehearsed denials. Carlson answered the questions smoothly, portraying himself as an ordinary man who had been unjustly targeted by a desperate police force. He was plausible, articulate, and utterly unconvincing. There was a rehearsed quality to his answers, a slickness that felt more like a performance than a genuine account. The real drama began when it was time for the cross-examination. Prosecutor Hannah Porter approached the stand, her eyes locking onto Carlson's with an intensity that promised a battle. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation. This was the main event, the confrontation that everyone had been waiting for, the brilliant, tenacious prosecutor against the arrogant, sociopathic killer. Porter began not by attacking him, but by complimenting him. "Mr. Carlson," she said, her voice even, "you're a very intelligent man, aren't you? Meticulous. A planner." Carlson's ego swelled, and he couldn't help but agree. "I like to be organized." "Yes," he replied with a self-satisfied smile. This was his first mistake. He had walked directly into her trap. Over the next 2 hours, Hannah Porter systematically dismantled him, using his own arrogance as her weapon. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked quiet, precise questions, each one backed by a piece of irrefutable evidence. She asked him about his travels, and he described them as business trips. She then showed the jury the receipts for the shovels, tarps, and lye that he had purchased on those same trips in towns where women had later gone missing. She asked him about his journals, and he dismissed them as fictional writings, a hobby. Porter then read an entry from his journal, a chillingly detailed account of stalking a woman in Boise, Idaho. She followed it by putting up a photograph of a young woman from Boise who had vanished without a trace on the very date of the journal entry. Carlson's response was a dismissive coincidence. The word hung in the air, its absurdity a testament to his pathological detachment from reality. The residents of Salt Lake City, a community that values honesty and accountability, watched this display of brazen lying with stunned revulsion. His inability to show even a hint of shame, his constant smirking denials in the face of overwhelming proof, was an affront to their most deeply held beliefs. He was not just lying to a court of law, he was lying to God and to the entire community, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. The breaking point came when Porter questioned him about the murder kit found in his car. "That's just camping gear," Carlson insisted, a lie so transparent it was almost comical. "Camping gear?" Porter repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. "Carlson, do you often go camping with duct tape, zip ties, and industrial-grade lye?" Carlson's composure finally began to crack. His calm demeanor gave way to a visible irritation, the first genuine emotion he had shown. "I have a lot of hobbies," he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. The mask was slipping, revealing the angry, frustrated monster underneath. He was losing control of the narrative, and he hated it. The final blow came when Porter returned to the subject of Aubrey Holland. She walked him through his supposed alibi for that day, an alibi that had already been disproven by cell tower data. As he repeated his lies, his story began to change, the small details shifting as he struggled to keep his fabricated timeline straight. He grew flustered, his answers becoming more convoluted and defensive. Hannah Porter let him talk, letting him weave his own web of lies, and then she pounced. "Mr. Carlson, you just told this jury you were 40 miles away at a job site, but a moment ago you said you were at a supply store. Which lie would you like them to believe?" Carlson stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. He was caught, exposed, his superior intellect failing him in the most public way imaginable. He had taken the stand to prove he had outsmarted everyone. Instead, his staggering arrogance and transparent lies had destroyed what little was left of his defense. He had not just failed to convince the jury of his innocence, he had provided them with the most compelling evidence of his guilt. As he walked away from the witness stand, his confident stride was gone, replaced by the stiff, angry gait of a man who had been thoroughly and completely defeated. The game was over, and he had lost. As the trial neared its conclusion, the time came for the victim impact statements, a moment for the court to hear not about the evidence of the crime, but about the enduring consequences of the loss. It was the Holland family's opportunity to speak for Aubrey, to give voice to the void her absence had created. Aubrey's mother, a woman who had carried her grief with quiet dignity throughout the trial, walked to the podium, clutching a folded piece of paper in her trembling hand. She did not address the judge, nor did she look at Tyler Carlson, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her pain. Instead, she spoke directly to the jury, her voice soft but filled with a strength that captivated the silent courtroom. She spoke of Aubrey as a child, her laughter, her dreams, her kindness. She painted a portrait of a life rich with love and promise, a life that had been a gift to everyone who knew her. Then, her voice cracking with emotion, she unfolded the paper. "I want to read you something," she said. "This is a letter Aubrey wrote to herself for a college assignment. She was supposed to open it on her 30th birthday. The courtroom held its breath. This was a voice from beyond the grave, a testament to a future that would never be. Aubrey's mother began to read. The letter was full of the hopeful, optimistic plans of a young woman on the cusp of her life. Aubrey wrote about her dreams of traveling the world, of starting her own design firm, of falling in love and having a family. She wondered if she would have a dog, if she would still be friends with her college roommates, if she had finally learned to cook. The words were so simple, so universal, and so utterly heartbreaking. Each sentence was a fresh stab of grief, a reminder of all the experiences, big and small, that had been stolen from her. The jury listened, their faces a mixture of profound sadness and growing anger. They were not just hearing about a murder, they were feeling the weight of a stolen future, the loss of every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary day that Aubrey would never get to live. In the midst of this profoundly emotional moment, Tyler Carlson's reaction was a study in monstrous indifference. He listened to the letter with his head cocked, a faint analytical smirk on his face. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only a chilling detachment. At one point, as Aubrey's mother described her daughter's dream of having children, Carlson was seen visibly yawning, rolling his eyes, and then looking up at the clock on the courtroom wall, a gesture of such profound contempt it was shocking. This single, callous act was, for many in the courtroom, the breaking point. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, a demonstration of a soul so empty that the deepest expression of human grief was nothing more than a source of boredom. The yawn of contempt was more damning than any piece of forensic evidence. It was a confession of his character, a final, irrefutable sign of the monster that he was. The letter continued, each word a testament to the vibrant life that had been extinguished. "I hope you are happy." Aubrey had written to her future self, "I hope you are kind, and I hope you never forget how lucky you are to be alive." As her mother read these final words, a wave of audible sobs swept through the gallery. The raw, emotional power of the moment was overwhelming. For the community of Salt Lake City, a place where family and the promise of the future are held as sacred, this was the ultimate crime. Carlson had not just taken a life, he had erased a legacy. He had stolen a daughter, a future mother, a contributing member of their society, and he had done so with a yawn. The act was unforgivable, a sin against the very core of their values. When Aubrey's mother finished, she carefully folded the letter, placed it on the podium, and walked back to her seat, her head held high. She had done what she had set out to do. She had made Aubrey real for the jury. She had shown them the true measure of their loss, and she had allowed her daughter's own words to serve as the final, heartbreaking testament against the man who had murdered her. The letter, a simple piece of paper filled with a young woman's dreams, had become the most powerful weapon in the fight for justice, a final, eloquent plea from a life that had been silenced too soon. With the evidence presented and the emotional weight of the victim impact statement still heavy in the air, the prosecution had one final, shocking revelation to present to the court. Hannah Porter called a surprise rebuttal witness, a man named Evan Hayes, whose name had not been mentioned previously in the proceedings. As Hayes walked to the stand, a nervous, unassuming man in his early 30s, Tyler Carlson, watched him with a look of utter confusion, a rare sign that he did not know what was coming. Evan Hayes identified himself as a former friend of Carlson's, someone who had known him years ago when they both worked for a construction company in Oregon. Their friendship had been casual, he explained, centered around hiking and camping. But as Hayes began to speak, he revealed a secret, horrifying side to Tyler Carlson that no one, not even the investigators, had fully understood until this moment. Hayes testified that Carlson had a strange, obsessive hobby, collecting trophies. But these were not the trophies of a sportsman or a collector. Hayes, his voice trembling, described a time they were on a remote hiking trip and Carlson had shown him a small, locked box he kept hidden in his backpack. Inside the box, Carlson had a collection of small personal items, a driver's license, a single earring, a house key, a child's beret. At the time, Hayes said, Carlson had laughed it off as a strange game, claiming he had found the items. But the look in Carlson's eyes had been unsettling, a possessive, predatory gleam that Hayes had never forgotten. It was only years later when he saw Carlson's face on the national news in connection with the Aubrey Holland case that the true, horrifying meaning of that box of trophies became clear. This testimony was a stunning bombshell. It confirmed what investigators had long suspected but had never been able to prove. Tyler Carlson was not just a murderer but a prolific serial killer who had been hunting victims for over a decade. The items in the box were mementos from his forgotten victims, trophies taken to commemorate his secret kills. He was a trophy hunter, and human lives were his game. Prosecutor Hannah Porter then asked Hayes if he knew where Carlson might have kept these trophies. Hayes, looking sick with fear and guilt for not coming forward sooner, told them about a remote, abandoned cabin they had sometimes used as a base for their trips deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He provided the exact coordinates, a location unknown to the police. While Hayes was testifying in Salt Lake City, law enforcement in Oregon was already moving on that information. The final revelation came in a stunning, real-time moment in the courtroom. Hannah Porter was handed a note which she read to the judge. She then announced to the jury that, acting on Mr. Hayes's information, police had just entered the cabin. There, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they had found the box. The contents of the box were even more horrifying than Hayes had described. Inside were the driver's licenses of 3 women and 1 man who were listed as missing persons. There were credit cards, rings, and other personal items, a small, sad museum of stolen lives. Most chillingly, there was a collection of disposable cameras. The courtroom was in a state of shock. Tyler Carlson, who had maintained his arrogant composure throughout the trial, finally seemed to crumble. His face went pale, his confident smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury. This was his secret world, his most private collection, and it had just been exposed. The trophy hunter had been unmasked. This final revelation recontextualized the entire case. The murder of Aubrey Holland was not an isolated event, but the latest in a long, horrifying series of crimes. Carlson was not just a killer, he was a collector of people, a predator who memorialized his kills with these small, pathetic trinkets. The polite, orderly society of Salt Lake City had been the hunting ground for one of the country's most patient and prolific serial killers. For the Holland family, the news was a complex mix of emotions. There was the horror of understanding the true depth of Carlson's evil, but there was also a sense of purpose. Aubrey's death had, in a strange and tragic way, been the key that unlocked a decade of secrets. Her case had brought a monster to light, a monster who might have otherwise continued to kill, to collect his trophies in silence for years to come. As Evan Hayes stepped down from the stand, the jury looked at Tyler Carlson with new eyes. They were no longer just seeing the man who had murdered Aubrey Holland. They were seeing a monster responsible for a trail of death that stretched across the country, a man whose secret hobby was the collection of human souls. The final piece of the puzzle had been put into place, and the picture it revealed was one of absolute, undeniable evil. The prosecution rested its case, confident that the trophy hunter's reign was finally over. The day of sentencing was a day of reckoning for Tyler Carlson and for the city of Salt Lake City. The jury had returned a guilty verdict on all counts in record time, their decision a swift and decisive condemnation of his crimes. Now all that remained was for the judge to hand down the sentence, to officially close the book on Carlson's horrifying chapter of violence and terror. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, a community gathered to witness the final act of justice. Tyler Carlson entered the courtroom with his familiar arrogance, the verdict having done nothing to humble him. He smiled at his lawyers, winked at a news camera, and took his seat as if he were the guest of honor at an awards ceremony. He was convinced, even then, that he was in control, that this final proceeding was just one more formality in a game he had already transcended. He believed he had outsmarted them all, and that even in defeat he was a legend. The Holland family delivered their final statements, speaking of their unending love for Aubrey and the permanent gaping hole her loss had left in their lives. They spoke with a quiet, powerful grace that stood in stark contrast to the defendant's smug theatricality. When they were finished, the judge turned to Carlson and asked if he had anything to say before the sentence was imposed. Carlson stood, a confident smirk spreading across his face. He looked at the Holland family, at the jury, and at the judge, and began to speak, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'd just like to say," he began, "that this has been a very interesting process, a real learning experience." The sheer narcissistic audacity of the statement left the courtroom speechless. He was not going to apologize. He was going to offer a critique. But the judge, a man who had presided over the trial with immense patience and judicial restraint, had finally reached his limit. He held up a hand, cutting Carlson off mid-sentence. "Mr. Carlson," the judge said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you will be silent. You have forfeited the right to speak in this room. You are not a philosopher. You are not a guest. You are a convicted murderer, a monster who preyed on the innocent, and you will now listen." The judge then delivered a blistering speech, a torrent of righteous fury that stunned the courtroom. He spoke of the sanctity of life, of the profound evil of Carlson's actions, and of the insult his behavior had been to the rule of law. He described him as a cancer on the soul of the community, a pathetic, empty man who built a monument to his own insignificance with the lives of others. As the judge's words rained down upon him, Tyler Carlson's arrogant facade finally began to crack. His smirk faltered, his confident posture sagged. The judge was not playing his game. He was naming him, defining him, stripping him of the power and mystique he had so carefully constructed. For the first time, Carlson was not the one in control, and the shock of it seemed to physically diminish him. Then came the sentence. The judge looked directly at Carlson, his eyes filled with a cold, hard finality. "For the murder of Aubrey Holland," he declared, his voice booming through the silent room, "and for the trail of terror you have carved across this country, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in a cage, and you will die in that cage, and the world will be a better place for it." As the words "life in prison" echoed in the courtroom, the shattered facade of Tyler Carlson completely collapsed. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant control for months, contorted in a way no one had ever seen. His mouth fell open, his eyes widened in genuine pathetic disbelief, and a strange gulping sob escaped his lips. The monster, stripped of his power and his audience, was reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess of self-pity. The man who smiled at the judge, who threatened grieving families, who yawned at a mother's pain, was now openly weeping, his body shaking with ragged, ugly sobs. It was not the sound of remorse. It was the sound of a narcissist whose world had just ended. He had not cried for his victims, but he was crying for himself, for the loss of his freedom, his power, and his game. As the bailiffs came to lead him away, a broken and blubbering wreck, the courtroom erupted in applause. It was a cathartic, emotional release for a city that had been held hostage by his evil for so long. The Holland family hugged each other, tears of relief and sorrow streaming down their faces. Justice, true and final, had been served. The monster had been caged, and his final, arrogant smile had been wiped away, replaced by the pathetic, weeping face of a man who had finally and completely been defeated.